So, you probably consider yourself to be free. But how free are you really? Nobody's entirely free. But do we even have that concept of being free? It's kind of a unique idea. It hasn't always been that way. Back in the time of kings and queens and aristocracy, you were as free as they decided you were going to be, which wasn't very free. So, Tim and I discussed some of that going back into the 19th century. Boring. This is where it all comes from. This is how we are today. So, it might be a good idea to learn a bit about it, about where we've come from. That will help you figure out where the hell we're going.
We're all three Unitarians. Jefferson even gets to the point where he makes his own Bible and he looks at the New Testament and he strips out all the miracles, all the mention of Jesus being the Son of God, and he's left with just the teachings of the parables and the Sermon on the Mount. And he sees that as the essence of what he considers the greatest contributions Christianity could make to the world. And that became his Bible.
I can see that. Yeah.
And it was this uh, age of enlightenment thinking.
I'm just going to kind of preface what you're about to say here because I did want to bring in Age of Enlightenment
Yeah.
because I think it has so much to do with how we get from what you've been talking about to where we are now. The idea that we don't need somebody else to do our thinking and our discovering for us. That's up to us.
Hmm.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the age of enlightenment is an outgrowth of the Protestant Reformation. It is also the outgrowth of the changing economic order, where our the economy of the world is moving away from this mercantilist notion of nation states being entities unto themselves. They are the economic movers to the point that um, the changes, the merchant class emerges, the shopkeepers and the industrialists, they become the movers and the creators of the economy of that time period. And it sort of overthrows the notion that the nation is the controller of the economy and it puts it in the
And when you
hands of,
say nation, you mean the aristocracy or
yeah,
like that.
right.
Yeah.
And so the mercantilist policies of, say, France and England and Spain and Portugal, they're all built this plunder that they engage in around the world in terms of trade and human trafficking and all of that goes to accrue to the national treasury. It doesn't go to the accrue to individual business people. That's an accumulation that is absorbed by the monarch.
Mhm.
And that's really the tension that creates the overthrow of the monarchy. And it's what the French Revolution was all about, was to overthrow the monarchy and replace it with a middle class people who they called the bourgeoisie,
Mhm.
the merchant class, the people who were the business people of the state. They were the middle class between the peasantry and the aristocracy. And they felt put upon.
Mhm.
They felt that their efforts and their work were being taken from them by the treasury of the king, of the monarch. And so that starts a whole series of revolutions throughout Europe that continue throughout the 19th century. And there are challenges to the power of monarchy. That's what the revolutions of
Yeah.
1848 were all about.
Yeah, I'd like to get to 1848 because that's something that I'm fairly aware of, and it's got to be really important. But um, you're getting right to the part that really gets to me is, and at least theoretically, so you tell me if you agree, getting back to slavery, which is what we started talking about. In a time past, when you had top-down control, slavery was almost part of the normal order of things, because it's all top-down anyway. So everybody at the bottom is, whether you call them slave, serf, or you
Uh-huh.
could even call them a freeman. But
Or
how free were
peasants.
they?
Yeah.
Yeah, how free was a peasant? Yeah. Um, So you have the Age of Enlightenment, you have the mercantile class saying, wait a minute, we don't need all these people on top, taking advantage of us. We're our own people, we'll handle it. And my perspective is then, as they assert more of their own individuality and their own right to their own freedom, then they look at the slaves and they go, well, wait a minute. if we want that kind of freedom, should they have that kind of freedom?
Mhm.
And what I'm getting at is today we say, well, of course, but this is beginning something had to begin to discover is, hey, wait a minute. Slavery doesn't make sense relative to what we think is important. But in a
Mhm.
time past, it made sense. That's what I'm getting
Yeah.
at.
Well, that's where the ideological constructs of racial categories comes to play.
But if I can just throw, I'm not sure it's all racial,
Yeah,
you know.
right. But it's the circumstance you find yourself in. It's almost a fatalistic kind of system at that point. If and this is where Calvin and Luther would have agreed with each other, and maybe even the Catholic Church. If you were born poor, it's because God meant you to be poor, and it meant you to that you were meant to be exploited. That's your lot in life. There wasn't a notion that there was anything about social mobility. It would happen for a limited few,
Mhm.
but that breaks apart that kind of stratified social structure, rigid stratified social structure gets broken apart by the creation of that middle merchant class. They start pushing at both ends of
And
that.
at least later on, especially maybe especially in the Americas, but later on, you do have people who bust out of there. You know,
Yeah,
you that's what like down. We started rewatching Downton Abbey, and shows like that. And they point out that people who come from essentially nowhere end up with more riches than the rich,
yeah.
and they start controlling the situation. And so it really turns everything on its head. Um,
But
so
there is an ideological framework that goes back to that 1450 time period that gets more and more stratified and more rigid.
mhm.
Um, and it becomes the justification for slavery because slavery creates a lot of cognitive dissonance on the part of the slaveholder, a lot of cognitive
Well, sure.
dissonance.
Yeah.
And
On the part of the slave too, I think.
oh, sure,
Yeah.
on all fronts, that is very true because there's just no reconciling this kind of arrangement that makes sense to the human mind. And so an ideology has to be built and reinforced and doubly reinforced once even people like Thomas Jefferson were hugely conflicted
Hmm.
about the idea of slavery. On his notes on Virginia, he reveals his hesitancy and his um, lament that slavery ever came to be because he recognized that he can't, in his moral framework, justify it.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, he's profiting off of it, and he's one of the biggest human traffickers of his time
Yeah.
period.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me this is what I get from Jefferson is as he says this is wrong and how can we white folks be fighting for our freedom from the king and then enslaving black people? I think at least part of it is the recognition that, and certainly Lincoln and others recognize this. Yeah, it's easy enough to not easy, but if you say to the slave, okay, you're free now. Well, what good does that do them? Free to
Mhm.
do what? You know, they don't own property. They don't
Yeah,
have anywhere to go.
that was why Reconstruction was such an important um, event. But to go back quickly to Jefferson, he even in his first draft of the Declaration of Independence, when he's listing the grievances
Mhm.
against England, he lays the responsibility for the importation and the creation of the slave system in America onto the British.
Right.
He wants to blame them for it.
Yeah, I never bought into that, but yeah, he did
That
that.
was his
Yeah.
justification, and that was the way he was trying
Yeah.
to morally weasel his way around on all of this. But that even that got struck from the final version of the Declaration because the rest of the Virginia plantation owners who were his colleagues of Madison and Patrick Henry and all of the others who were deeply invested in slavery said, "You can't put that in there. We're cutting our own throats if we do that because you're saying that we want to get rid of slavery and we don't want to get rid of slavery. It's too beneficial for us." And so Jefferson, in his ambivalence, um, he caves and agrees to that, but he's terribly troubled by it. And he carries that with him to his deathbed. And that's why shortly before he died, he did grant emancipation to people who were directly related to him by blood. Not all of them, but some of them. The people related to Sally Hemings, who was his wife's half sister.
Mhm.
And that's probably why he fell in love with her, because she reminded him of his first wife who died.
Mhm.
And she was born into slavery because Jefferson's wife's father had fathered children
Yeah, and it's
with the women that he had enslaved.
yeah. I think no matter how much I try to get my head, at a level of how much interbreeding was going on between slaves and masters, every time I think I know where it was, it's higher than that.
It is.
There was a lot of that going on.
Well,
And it was its own social cultural thing was the people born of slave and master. It was its own kind of fairly well disguised. Let's not talk about this too much, but it had its own thing as far as how you deal with, like you're saying, freeing these people and not those people. And uh, you run into that. These people who are technically slaves because one of the parents was a slave, but the other one was the master. So they're almost a member of the family, but not quite. And
that's why that whole notion of one drop of blood
yeah,
means that you're
yeah,
black,
yeah.
because they could not afford to grant citizenship to someone who had a white father. And sexual enslavement, which is what it was more the rule than the exception. At the time, in 1860, with the 1860 census, they used the term mulatto.
Yes.
And mulatto, the root word for mulatto is mule. And a mule is a product of two different species, a superior species and a subspecies, the horse mating with the donkey. So a mulatto is the product of two species separate from each other, one superior and one inferior.
Mm.
And you get this mulatto byproduct. The mulatto population in the South that was enslaved was fully 10% of the 4 million people who were still enslaved. So that's
I just,
400,000.
yeah, I would be surprised if it was higher than 10%.
Well,
It just
right.
seems you just run into it everywhere, as you read.
Well, that's just the number that's counted
Mhm.
in the 1860
Okay,
census.
okay.
But of the thousands of people who escaped enslavement and made it to the North, a large percentage of those people were mixed blood,
Mhm.
because if they were light skinned blacks, they could figure out ways of disguising themselves and passing as white through the
As
Underground
in
Railroad.
Uncle Tom's
So
Cabin, yeah.
many of the people that escaped on the Underground Railroad and found freedom were, in fact, mulatto,
Mhm.
were of mixed blood, and they were lighter skinned. And Harriet Beecher Stowe makes a point about that. She doesn't explicitly say it in her novel, but when she describes Eliza as almost white, as a very light skinned black.
And at the Harry Beecher Stowe house, they have a depiction of Eliza. If you didn't know she's supposed to be black, it would never occur to you
Yeah,
she's
she looks
black.
like
Yeah,
a white woman
yeah, yeah,
crossing the Ohio River
yeah,
carrying
yeah,
her baby.
yeah.
And that was the case for many people who did escape enslavement, because if you start looking at the people who were coming to the United States from Europe, many of them, particularly after we start getting more Eastern European people, they're darker skinned than the Northern European people, and so it becomes easier and easier to pass as a mixed blood person who has lighter skin, and so it is complex, and this also leads to this um, psychological damage that's done to the Southern family. The the wife of a plantation owner knows full well what's going on.
Mhm.
And oftentimes those children who are born from those relationships end up working in the house.
And that's what I'm saying. They're almost family members, but
Right.
but not quite.
But they're resented by the white women of the house. And it's a very, very complex relationship
Mhm.
of sometimes respect and then just absolute hatred, because it represents the infidelity of their husbands.
Mhm.
And so that kind of stuff has to wreak havoc on the psychology of the people engaged in this. And I'm sure there were in some situations where the relationship between the enslaved woman and the owner of that enslaved woman, there's affection
I
that
believe that.
sometimes
Yeah, I
exists.
believe that.
And it becomes incredibly confusing and incredibly complex for that to happen. And it it leads to this whole notion of sexual politics. And what happens here is there's a projection of the white male infidelity and rape of black women projected onto black men as being a threat to white womanhood, when all along it was white manhood that was a threat to black womanhood. So there was a great amount of psychological projection going on.
Mhm.
And that mythology of the black sexual predator then takes hold. It's a projection. The other thing that goes on is the whole notion of selective breeding. When you start picking people to mate with each other and forcing them to mate with each other because of their physical characteristics, you start creating all kinds of psychological chaos
Sure.
inside the enslaved community.
Mhm.
Because there are some black men then who were created like um, bulls. They're put out as
Mhm.
studs,
Mhm.
and they're sent from plantation to plantation to breed with other women on those plantations because they have such tremendous physical characteristics, and they want those physical characteristics to be working in the fields. And so when you start treating humans like livestock like that, the damage that's done is horrendous. And it it just leads to tremendous distortion and social chaos. And all the while, we get this narrative of the peaceful plantation
Yeah.
as the veneer under which all of this other chaotic stuff is going on that is dehumanizing and ugly.
You said what you just said, and surprise, surprise, what jumped into my head was the movie The Song of the South,
Yeah,
which it's hard to find. I found it again. I mean, I showed it on TV when I was a kid, but
yeah,
I had to go looking for it more recently, maybe 5 years ago. And I watched that, and boy, it's almost like, what am I seeing here? Because they don't tell you exactly who these people are. Is this a slave plantation or isn't it? It kind of seems that way, but you don't know.
yeah.
But Uncle Remus, and I can't remember the white matron's name, but anyway, they're affectionate towards each other. There's no tension. Uh, and Uncle Remus being this old black guy, is he a slave? I don't know. They never tell you, but there's an affection, like uh, they're in it together in a way. And it's a movie. It's intended to get you to get an impression of things, but that they even do that
Mm.
says something. And then I thought also interestingly, the only, what do we call it, dramatic conflict or whatever you want to say, it's not between blacks and whites, it's about the white kids and the plantation owner grandchildren or whatever, 10, 12 years old, and the poor white kids on the, what do you call them, dirt farmers, what do you call them,
Yeah, yeah,
truck farmers, what, anyway, they're little heads, and they're just, Uncle Remus teaches these plantation white kids how to deal with those kids. And I thought, boy, it's interesting.
it becomes incredibly complex, but it's certainly part of this counter narrative
Yeah,
to Harriet's
yeah,
narrative in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And, you know, I've come up with my own term to understand how this took place is we have a different CRT that really is at play here, and it's called Confederate race theory, not critical race theory,
okay.
but Confederate race theory, which weaves this tale of the happy South
Oh, yeah.
and the idyllic agricultural backbone of America,
Mhm.
providing all of these staples for the rest of the country and empowering the Industrial Revolution, and that it is an ideal situation.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to kind of stress early on is the number of people, including Cornelia Randolph there,
Yeah,
who truly felt like this was a good thing for the blacks. They
yes.
benefited. Uh,
That's what
yeah,
all those Southern Romantic novels were
yeah,
about.
yeah.
And then the reality of that, particularly in South Carolina, in rice culture, the black rice planters knew nothing about rice cultivation. They were coming from England and other places, but primarily England. And they imported labor, human trafficked labor, to come to South Carolina because they knew how to plant rice. They had the expertise, the knowledge of how to create canal systems and flood rice fields and drain rice fields. Those European planters that ended up in South Carolina had no clue.
Hmm.
They needed that African labor that had this expertise that knew it. And they are the ones that taught the Southern planters how to cultivate rice. And the same thing with cotton. Cotton was a product of Egypt. And there were skills that Africans had that Europeans just did not have that experience. Their European agriculture was not a cotton friendly agriculture
Mhm,
because of the climate.
mhm,
And so they had to import the kind of labor they needed to carry out these large agricultural plantations and do it properly. And so it was always um, one of the biggest parts of this mythology, and it's even coming through with Governor DeSantis, who's tried to rewrite the history of the South with his curriculum on slavery and saying that Africans learned valuable work skills. They already had those work
mhm.
skills. They brought those with them with their importation, and that was one of the things that happened with James Bradley, one of the Lane Seminary rebels, who was an African American who had been kidnapped from Angola at the age of 5.
I thought he was born in the States, no?
No, he was born in Africa and he was
Okay.
kidnapped. He ended up in a rice plantation in Arkansas,
Okay.
and he had such great skill. He ended up managing the plantation that he was enslaved on.
Which I don't think was necessarily that unusual either.
No, it wasn't because, again, they brought skills with them.
Mhm,
He hated enslavement, secretly taught himself to read and write, purchased his freedom because he worked odd jobs and earned enough money to buy his freedom. Ends up in Lyman Beecher's study asking for admission to Lane Theological Seminary. And he was an equal to the students there because he had taught himself all of these skills.
mhm.
And so it's an interesting thing about how the mythology of all of this occurs. And Bradley is a shining example of how the argument that the colonization movement made that Europeans and Africans could never live together if slavery had immediately disappeared because you can't have one inferior population of people living with a superior population of people. It just won't work. And they maintained up and down, and this is because of the racial category stratification, that Africans were intellectually inferior to Europeans. And even the Age of Enlightenment thinkers thought that.
Yeah.
John Locke, Montesquieu,
Albion
Rousseau.
Tourgy, if you really read between the lines, he's very solicitous and compassionate to these freed slaves that he's now come from the South, and he's a carpetbagger, and he's got his plantation. He's working with them. He's not super, top, not so much top down as working with them. He praises them and shows how many of them have really lifted themselves up. Underlying that all that still is a kind of a sense of, but I'm
He
the
does
white
have
guy.
this sense of
I'm the white
superiority.
guy. They're the black people. So
And he had this sense of mission about him.
yeah.
What he was trying to do was to create an opportunity for equality.
Hmm.
And he ends up writing the Constitution, the Reconstruction Constitution for North Carolina. And then he is the lawyer that represents Homer Plessy in the Plessy
I
versus
didn't even know
Ferguson.
that. I didn't know that.
He's the
Mhm.
lawyer that represents Homer Plessy in Plessy versus Ferguson. And he coins the phrase colorblind justice, that that Justice Harlan uses in his dissent. And then in 1954, the Supreme Court uses Albion Tourgé's language of colorblind justice to make the Brown v. Board decision ending desegregation in America. And so Tourgé is just an incredible mind
Mhm.
in all of this. When Tourgé died, W.B. Du Bois went to the funeral and he said, Albion Tourgé, Frederick Douglass, and William Lloyd Garrison are three of the most courageous men of the abolitionist movement. And it's a real testament that here's W.B. Du Bois even identifying Tourgé as an intellectual and political giant among the movement for freedom for people.
Mhm.
But he's still got his own baggage of
I was gonna
racism that
say-
he's got to
I was just
overcome.
going to say baggage. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting because I can't remember the exact term he used to call his house, but it was something like, "This is Carpetbag Palace." And he changed my whole notion of what a carpetbagger was all about,
Oh, for
because
sure.
he was seriously motivated by the right reasons.
Mhm.
And because he really wanted to see justice, and he helped to forge what William Barber today is saying, this fusion politics of poor whites and poor blacks to create a democratic movement. And the fusion democratic movement that he formed in the 1880s and 1890s in North Carolina is the basis for all that, because there was they founded a group of um, Reconstruction advocates that were carrying on, and it was not until, what was it, 1898, I guess, when the Ku Klux Klan overcomes the government of Wilmington, North Carolina, and kills all of them. It was a multiracial government still in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, and they overthrow it, and then they overthrow the Constitution that Tourgé writes. He lives, I think, until the early, like 1905 or
Yeah,
six,
yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
And what a remarkable man.
very much. Yeah.
And he that's one of the reasons why he ended up being one of my heroes, just because how he stood up and the fact that he could go toe to toe with the Klan. And Thomas Dixon, the guy that wrote The Klansman, that the movie The Birth of a Nation was based on, he put Tourgé as a character in his book. And Tourgé ends up becoming the archetypal carpetbagger in Birth of a Nation. They use his name because they wanted to demonize him.
You know, I have Birth of a Nation on a DVR. So help me
It's-
one of these days. I
it's
feel like
so
I have
hard to
I
watch.
have to watch it.
It is so hard to watch,
Yeah,
and but Tourgé is a character.
I didn't. Well,
And he's-
now I even more have to watch.
He's
it.
considered the villain,
Yeah. Oh, he would have to be. Yeah.
and yeah, so it's an amazing thing. But I know we were also going to talk about how the Industrial Revolution, the well, one of the things, let's go back, I guess, to the revolutions and the overthrow of monarchy in Europe. The revolutions of 1848 were a remarkable event. This was an attempt to overthrow monarchy and establish a middle class society and system of government. And this is the same time that Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto. He actually writes it for the revolutions of 1848.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many misconceptions about what the Communist Manifesto has to say.
If you have easy, obvious answers to the questions of how did we get here and what is good about us and what is bad about us, if you have nice, simple, easy answers, you're probably wrong. It's very complex. There's been a lot going on. Obviously, there is a lot going on. If you've been paying attention, you now see how it took a good century just to even make a dent into the racial issue, into the slavery issue of the 19th century. And going forward with Tim, we're going to talk about more modern issues such as capitalism, communism. Which one's the good one? Which one's the bad one? Maybe they're both good. Maybe they're both bad. It doesn't have to be either or.